Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see everyone here today. My name is Christina Balboa, and I'm the director of the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management at Baruch College, City University of New York. I want to welcome you to this event today to talk about participatory budgeting in New York City. And we have on the docket several experts to talk about this issue, but right now I just want to quickly let you in on upcoming events, let you know about some upcoming events at the center. So in April, every year we have something called Consulting Day, where we offer free 1-hour consulting appointments to nonprofits in the New York City area. Because we are all virtual and we can't physically be in a room together, we've changed that format to be consulting days. So we'll have from April 12th to the 23rd, a series of appointments that nonprofits in the New York City area will be able to sign up for to receive consulting from professional experts on nonprofit management. And so I hope that you all will join our mailing list, and I'll put information about this in the chat room in a minute, and spread the word about Nonprofit Consulting Day and participate in Nonprofit Consulting Day. So once again, welcome to this discussion on participatory budgeting in New York City. We have a great panel to discuss the findings of this new book that was published just late last year. We have Dan Williams, who's a professor at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs, one of the authors of the report, and Don Waisanen, who's another professor at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. These are the co-authors of the report. They're going to present a little bit of their findings. And then we have two commentators who have a lot of experience and expertise in participatory budgeting as well. So we'll hear from Yulia Shybalkina from the University of Kentucky, whose area of expertise includes participatory budgeting and other highly localized programs and governance. And Francesco Tena, who's currently at the Coro New York Leadership Center, who was, I believe, the founding leader of their first youth exclusive participatory budgeting process, and is also working to deploy participatory budgeting technology to other cities throughout the US through an organization called Pipeline to Power. So we have both academic and practitioner perspectives on this new report, new book. And that is exactly what we aim to do at the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management, is to connect practice with research. So without further ado, we'll hear from our presenters today. So Don, when you want to take it away?
Sure, great. Thanks for coming today, everybody. Just share my screen right now and let's get going on this. So Dan and I engaged in a year-long project with some graduate assistants, research assistants, that led to the culmination of this book we published late last year, Real Power, Real Money, Real Power, The Challenges with Participatory Budgeting in New York City. We want to just give you a little bit of an overview of what this project was and some of the findings so we can get to a great discussion about this. For the last several years, New York City has put out a call to action on behalf of citizens all around the 5 boroughs, asking, how would you spend $1 million? We're going to put real money and real power, the promise of participation into your hands. And so we've seen these signs up all over the place, and Dan has been exploring this in various studies. When I think about $1 million and what I would do with it, various things come to mind. I always think of that guy on Supermarket Sweep who filled his shopping cart with nothing but cheese. Everybody's got different preferences, right? But in this project, at least, there's a much greater purpose socially in giving people within a local community and neighborhoods the ability to put in playgrounds or new equipment and renovations for those, to update their local libraries. And this is, in this example here, is redoing the inside facade of a library setting, or even doing things like putting in timing on bus stops around the city, right? These are the kinds of issues that citizens both can come up with in local neighborhoods and have the chance to talk about and put into practice. So through these processes in New York City, for those unfamiliar, there's a process design, there's brainstorming and idea phases, there's phases where proposals are developed, among local communities to figure out how they would like funds allocated. There's a voting part of it where where various items on the agenda become ranked, and then eventually those winning projects are funded. Dan and I would just like to say from the outset, we are for this. The general ideas for this are fantastic. We like the idea of more funding being put into citizens' hands and being able to be decided on in participatory, democratic, and deliberative manners. But we wanted to ask some questions to start off with here, right? What does real mean in this context? What does real money mean? We just start with a couple premises on both the real money and real power parts of this. First up, $40 million out of $40 billion in the capital budget, or $130 billion in the combined capital expense budget, generally allocated for this. That's about 0.03% of the city's annual budget, or about 16% of the council members' discretionary capital budgets, right? To the next question, what about the power part of this? We'd say each council member who takes part in PB commits to the use of 20% of their allocated discretionary capital funds for PB, reserving 80% for other purposes. And Dan can speak a little bit more to this in just a bit, because he came out with a study with some colleagues quite recently in 2020, showing that overall, for about 100% of the funds, council members do not change the categories of their allocation. So we can break into that. And this is just to set from the outset, okay, real money, real power, that's a claim being made. We should interrogate that a little bit and see if it's rising to the promises that participatory budgeting can be for local communities. So there's Dan Williams, there's my colleague. He'll be talking to you in a bit. I wanted to pull up this photo because this is Happy Dan, right? This was us at the start of the project. Dan and our graduate assistants went all over New York City, went to council meetings, went to local participatory budgeting meetings. And what really stood out to me is that first meeting we expected to go to, we thought would be a bit like this, right? We're gonna show up and here's all the citizens of the community showing up and deliberating over important matters to them, how their budget might be spent. But it ended up looking a little bit more like this, right? This was what it ended up being like, and Dan can get into some details, but there was a lot that was confusing about it, like signage toward the event, right? And we started discovering initially this very massive variation between the different types of events. First of all, the way that council members in New York City approached participatory budgeting. And one of the conclusions of the report, just to forecast a little bit here, is that there are as many participatory budgeting processes in New York City as you can possibly imagine. It's not a universal sort of one size fits all process. So there's my picture that's the saddest picture of Dan I could find. We'll call that concerned Dan after he started going to these meetings. So there's 4 levels that we decided to frame this project with from the beginning. And that had to do, first of all, just with issues of power. Does participatory budgeting share power with the least advantaged community members? Are there inequalities around who has access, whose voices are there, those types of things? I thought that's definitely a lens we need on this. The other is the role of interest groups. We started genuinely asking, who is at these meetings? What backgrounds are they from? Are they part of coalitions or advocacy groups? Are there any kind of special interests at mine? The next was experts. We wanted to see, do experts, particularly those employed by the city, seek to substitute their judgment for those of the residents? What role does expertise play in these matters? So we wanted to examine those lines. And then lastly, just issues of potential clientelism, which is things like, quid pro quo processes that maybe could be unearthed or revealed around this. So we wanted to take a kind of critical lens from the outset, while also shining a light on what's good about this, and more than anything, what could be done to improve participatory budgeting in New York City. So there are 5 really big steps that take place with participatory budgeting. And the first is neighborhood assemblies. So we sent our researchers, including Dan, to these meetings to basically do an analysis of what happened at the neighborhood assemblies, who was talking, where were they from. We can get into some of the qualitative details about that, but we'll have results around there. The next was delegate meetings, and we'll hold off on that for just a moment because we had a very surprising finding about that. Project expos take place in about February in this annual cycle each year, where proposals are shared, there's community feedback, some more vetting. Finally, the big votes take place in March for what's going to happen within each of the council members' districts. And then there's implementation and monitoring, which actually brought up a thicket of other issues we hadn't anticipated. wanted to show you a few of the things we picked up along the way. This was an idea generating piece of paper from one of the meetings where you could just write down ideas you have that would be gathered, collected, and it got a little bit opaque beyond that, but somehow would be a mechanism to prioritizing ideas in the future and within local communities. There are websites dedicated to this in New York City as well, where you can submit ideas to. This is one for District 39. It's clouded out on my screen here, but there's also local district type of websites dedicated to this. And then this is at a neighborhood assembly. This was just an example of there's people sitting in a room and they're looking at all the different ideas that have come up and using a system like dot voting, put dots up for the two that you're most interested in talking about. Let's talk about it. The kind of process that we saw for participatory budgeting. Dan, could I borrow you for a second? Because I actually think you're probably better to speak to this moment than I am. You experienced it in real time. We got shut out of the delegate meetings, which in itself was an interesting finding. Dan, do you want to just share what that was like?
Well, we assume we were coming as naive community members. That's part of the whole point. We assume that since this is a government process, that it would be open meetings, and it's not. Not only is it not open meetings in that they wouldn't let us in, it's also not open meetings in that they don't tell anybody when they're happening. You have to be a delegate in the first place in order to even know when a meeting is happening. One council member simply told us we couldn't come. And I don't know if it was a council member himself or whether it was part of his staff, but it was coming directly from the council office. And then, I mean, because we didn't know that this was closed meetings, we had a human subjects approval that assumed that they were open meetings. So we had to change it, and that slowed us down. That was a problem too. But then once we changed it and sent the council office the language of the new, what is it, the consent form to participate, they simply said, no, don't come. And then another council member's office was perfectly willing to let us come, but they weren't willing to tell us when things were happening. We had a lot of trouble getting to meetings. I think my graduate assistant eventually got to one delegate meeting.
Yeah.
Might have been two,
And I think overall this suggested, this set off a cycle for us of going, who are the delegates to these meetings? How do they get selected? We started digging into some of our data on that. Why are these processes not as transparent or also uniform for people in New York City as they might be? It should be the case that one district isn't doing something different than another, right? If this is really this promise of democratic participation for as many people as possible. So it begged a lot of questions. So I'll finish up here, Dan, and then you can get to your part. We also did a lot of analysis of media around participatory budgeting in New York City for the entire year. This is just to give you, I won't recite these numbers, but a number of forms of communication that we dug into quantitatively to analyze what we found in those. And this is just an example, before Dan takes over here, of all the different types of meetings when they are in different districts. We mapped those out, wanted to see the timing of them. You know, was it the case that in one district, a meeting would be during people's working hours, right? That's pretty significant, potential working hours or not. And so we've had just a lot of differences going on between the way that districts approach this. So Dan, here we have a few things sort of going forward. Dan, you want to take over here and I will bring these up?
Okay, I just want to slightly correct the last thing Don said. That was a list of voting sites on one date.
Right.
Okay, so if you just show out the whole set of bullets here, I can talk about it better. Let me say, because of time limitations, in case we don't get all the way through, I'm going to get to our recommendations first, our findings second, and the evidence third. I know that generally in an academic talk, it's the reverse order, but recommendations are important. the most important takeaway from this in my mind. So we think all proposals should be open access, and they should be in an open access database where anybody can see them, and no proposals can be lost that way. And that's important. If you think back to that slide where we were looking at proposals that were being voted on in a neighborhood assembly, even before they left the room, they deleted more proposals than they used. And they weren't deleted because they weren't valid. They were deleted because they didn't get enough endorsement in the room. So that seems problematic to me. Then and these are really in rank order to a certain degree. We don't think proposals should be eliminated unless there is a specified reason, and it should be a reason that it shows that it's just not legitimate. There was a lot of concern about cost, and we think that the cost estimates should be provided in line item details so that people can understand the costs. And later on, when expenditures happen, we should be able to see that the line items are matched up to the expenditures, so we know that they actually spent the money on what they said. Of course, it won't be exact. I'm a budget guy, I understand that, but it should be a pretty good match if they're really giving us good cost estimates. City employees shouldn't be delegates. Maybe we should move on to the next slide because I'm taking a lot of time here. There are more recommendations. These slides we'll make available. Well, they're in the video, so you'll see them, but you can see them, but we'll make them available later.
Oh, sorry, I'll go back.
So the problems with voting staff is we saw volunteers who were advocates as voting staff. And so that really shouldn't be allowed. It should be very much more like a regular election where advocates have to stay away from the location where the voting is occurring. In fact, we don't think it's a good idea to even have budget delegates, and we have suggestions of other ways to do that. The budget delegates were problematic because most, as we'll see in the data, most of the budget delegates who we were able to see, which is not a large number, most of the budget delegates were advocates for particular projects, and their projects managed to get on the ballot, which was not true for other projects. And we had problems with the agencies cooperating, so we're saying the mayor should actually require the city agencies to cooperate with this process. Okay, move on to the next slide.
And we're going to do this one quickly because we had so much, but we'll just highlight some of the few things we need to.
So the delegate process was not available, as we talked about, particularly not to disadvantaged people who work in the evening. Most of the delegate meetings were in the evenings. They work in the evening. They have no daycare in the evenings. They weren't available. Some of the budget delegates were public employees, which seems to conflict with the idea of having a citizen-driven process. They were not neutral reviewers. The process was secretive. Move on to the next slide. We saw volunteers at pop-up locations who were advocating projects while they were officiating on the voting location. That seemed particularly problematic. We couldn't find a way where there was any central place, or in some council members' office, maybe not even the council members, for tracking how proposals that weren't in control of the delegates process from one point to the next. We had trouble getting answers about the process from council offices. By the way, there is no, or I've been told that some years there are, but the year we looked, there was no central council process for monitoring the overall process. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. City agencies refused to engage in participatory budgeting. We'll see some evidence of that in a minute. We heard one instance, I believe it might have been more than one, but we heard one instance where there was discussion of log rolling, vote trading, I'll vote for yours if you'll vote for mine. It has all the regular problems of a democracy that is unregulated, in other words. Go ahead to the next slide. 100% of the delegates who had proposals that we saw had them get onto the ballot. And about 30% of, these are small numbers, so using percents is kind of weird, but still what we could tell is not more than a third of the people who had proposals who were not delegates got them on the ballots from the people we talked to. Okay, go on. So here's from an actual, these are texts that we have from our conversations with people. This is from a delegate. No, oh yeah, this is from a delegate training meeting. We got to delegate training meetings. That's when we got kicked out of the delegate meetings. And there's discussion, and that's one training meeting where half the room was from the wealthiest neighborhood in the district, the council members' district. There was some discussion of, okay, we should look out for the other people anyhow. That was not a consensus view. Well, it became a consensus view, but it didn't start out as a consensus view. But there was nothing about getting the actual people from those neighborhoods into the meeting. I will also say, when they talked about a process of getting representation from those districts, they were talking about getting government officials to represent them, particularly principals from schools. And move ahead to the next one. So I imagine we don't have a lot more time. These slides will be available. There's one quote here that this is from a news media report that the council members will ask civic organizations to select the delegates, which suggests a lot of risk of clientelism or interest group involvement to me. And here, this represents a case where the department just isn't going to approve of the project. They're against it, so they're not going to cooperate with it.
And also there was the expectation that Parks was going to shut ideas down at various levels. That was a common theme.
That was a very common theme. And Parks is not the least cooperative agency that we heard about. That would be the Department of Transportation.
So we just wanted to end. That's an overview of what we had. We want to end just clarifying. We actually think participatory budgeting is a wonderful idea. It's well worth the investment of time and efforts that have been put into it in its various forms across the world. But simply getting excited about this novel enterprise while glossing over its problems is no solution for the public interest. And to this point, participatory budgeting tends to be wholly celebrated in a lot of literature by a lot of practitioners. So we don't do this just for the sake of endless critique, but we're actually thinking about reform and how do we make this thing better and make it work as it should. That's really the spirit in which this project was engendered. So thank you all.
Thank you, Don and Dan. That's very fascinating, and it's nice to see all the data. I wish we had more time to check out all the data that you had on the screen there. All the actual, context-specific quotes and conversations that you were able to capture. And the book is actually full of all of this data as well. So it's really kind of exciting to see. You kind of feel like you're in the process of engaging with participatory budgeting yourself as you read the book, which is it's engagingly written on this topic. So we're now going to turn to Yulia Shybalkina, who will give some thoughts as someone who has studied this process herself on the applicability of the findings. Yulia?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Christina and Dan and Don, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and share some of the experience that I have had with New York City PB. So first of all, I would like to highlight some of the, just excuse me for a second. Much better. So I would like to highlight some of the similarities between my experience and that of Dawn and Dan. So I also did some observations and interviews in 6 New York City districts in 2017-18, which is 1 year before Dawn and Dan, right? Because you did yours in 18-19. So I went to 6 districts, 2 in Manhattan, sort of high income, 2 median income, 1 in Queens and 1 in Brooklyn, and 2 more low income in Brooklyn. So very in a similar fashion, so I didn't collaborate with any of the districts or advocacy organizations, but I did contact district staff members in charge of PB in advance, telling them that I would be coming. And I expect that it's a public process and I'm very interested and I would like to be there to observe. So that's what I've done. So I have very similar takeaways. So first of all, there are transparency issues. Most info like schedules and project ideas, progression of project ideas. So those things were not publicly available. I had to request them from districts. Second, the process is very decentralized and—
Yulia, you may want to advance to the next slide. I see the preview, but not the full slide. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Let me reshare again. What about now? Christina?
Great. Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Sorry about that. So the second thing is the process is definitely not uniform. So for example, one of the high income districts in Manhattan that I went to, it had like an ideal process, right? So it had a district committee, and I don't think Dan and Don mentioned it, but it's something districts can do. So they can have like an advisory group of citizens that make recommendations on the process, help implement the process, help evaluate the process. So that district had that. So it's like an extra power sharing, extra authority sharing. So these districts also had all kinds of outreach techniques, 5 delegate meetings with all kinds of recommendations like food and childcare and things like that. It had also about like 5 delegate meetings. It had an expo to get to know more about projects. It had 8 physical voting locations. It also had a closing event to introduce winners, to evaluate the process, to plan for the future. So like, it was perfect. But then other districts had very different processes. For example, one of the low-income districts in Brooklyn, so literally they said they had PB, but I don't think they had one, right? So the only options available to residents were to first use that citywide online submission site to submit ideas. And then the other thing that they could do is they could go to a citywide voting system and vote. So basically that was it. And so staff members put together their ballot themselves. And I talked to them, they said they usually would use some ideas that they've heard from, I don't know, like constituencies or like elsewhere, and they use that to put together some ballot. So that was it for that district. So third, very similar, I think delegates were there to participate to represent their own projects. I did meet maybe like 2-3 people that were, so one person said, I just want to be here to, like I met that person the very first meeting. The person said, I want to be here to represent some project that doesn't have a voice. But then, and then I met another person who said, oh, I want to like try new things. So like, I'm just trying this as an activity. And then I never like saw those people again, right? so they dropped after the very first meeting. But so delegates who actually stayed there till the very end were there representing their own projects. And lastly, many ideas were ineligible or found no support from city agencies. For example, in one district, there was a lot of support for a project to install dryers and washers for homeless students in schools. And the school construction authority in charge of school capital projects found this project ineligible. Surprise, surprise, why? Because it was too cheap. So it was too cheap. So I mean, which again, as a budgeting person, I understand, like you cannot classify this as a capital project, but like, to people that sounded pretty ridiculous. Okay, so, but there have been some differences between my experience and the Dawn's and Dan's experience. So I should say that while not in the most timely and efficient manner, districts cooperated. And not in the most timely and efficient manner matters here, right? So our cooperation involved a lot of follow-ups, like follow-up after follow-up after follow-up. But then they did provide schedules, and they also did provide lists of ideas, like full lists of ideas that they had to work with. So there was only one district that said, I cannot share the full list of ideas that delegates worked with because it's an internal document. So I said, okay. I said, okay. So, but I did end up attending about 7 delegate meetings. So I think I did get a little bit more insight into how delegates processed sifted this project ideas. So I should say that some initial ideas were, as I think Dawn and then use this phrase, reflective of marginalized population. For example, one of the districts hold 2 neighborhood assembly ideas at homeless shelters, right? Which I think it's as good as it gets. However, a problem was that very few of these ideas advanced to the ballot stage, and practically none of these ideas won. So there were ideas to work with. That would be my that would be my takeaway. There were ideas to work with, but then there were no one there to advocate for those ideas throughout the process. And I agree that like personal presence and sort of advocacy was very important in this PB process to get that project to the finish line, right? If there was no one to advocate, there were no people who would just say, okay, I like this project, I have nothing to do with it, but I'm just going to be there for it. I don't think that happened. So one last thing that I would like to bring up is something called idea ranking tool. I think it's important to bring it up because I've heard people having a lot of hope associated with this tool. So this is something proposed by the city for budget delegates to use. So budget delegates, and I've seen budget delegates actually using this tool in some districts. So the idea is to give some of those projects that affect marginalized population more chance during the process. So delegates were instructed to use this tool to shortlist project ideas, and they were supposed to rank all the projects, all the initial project ideas based on 3 things: feasibility, need, and equity. So feasibility is like, is it doable? Need is, do people really need it? Like, is it going to be like a duplication or something like that? And equity, is it going to affect high need communities? So delegates used this tool and they did rank like a lot of projects high on equity, but then the end result was always the same. Like ballot was composed of projects that budget delegates advocated for. Like it doesn't matter whether they ranked them or didn't rank them, like the end result was always the same. Because for example, they could rank something high on equity, but then they could say, I don't really know whether it's doable or feasible. So like I'm going to rank it really low on feasibility. Again, and the end result is, as I've said. So I think lots of people have a lot of hope associated with this tool. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it being really helpful. Okay, so what's next? So some reflections. So I think that the variation in the process is inevitable, and this is something that other countries have to deal with too. And people really pay a lot of attention to studies from Brazil that describe the best cases. But I should say that there are a lot of studies that also describe not so great cases. It's just they are not so highly cited. So I think like New York is not a failure in any way. It's just there will always be a variation. And that's something that we should deal with. So in terms of like next steps, I think simply making participatory, and we know that like lots of districts in New York City still don't have PB, right? About 20 districts. So those residents can not participate in any way. So simply making PB required for all districts may result in a lot of weak processes. Like right now, there are already a lot of weak processes, and there may be even more of those weak processes. So perhaps it's possible to mandate, like to introduce very specific requirements in terms of how the process should look like. But then, of course, resources and incentives, everything varies across districts. So if the city wants to mandate a specific form of PB for districts, I think that it's going to be only fair for the city to help districts to implement PB in that particular way. So that would be, I guess, my preferred option. I know that some people also talk about centralizing PB and doing it more of a citywide initiative. I'm not sure how I feel about that, because I think there are a lot of benefits to having this process being at the district level. I've observed a lot of situations in which, for example, imagine a voting station, like a polling station, and then compare like a city volunteer recruiting people to vote, and the local person recruiting people to vote. I think local people were much more effective because they have personal connections. Which I know it's a little bit of what Don and Dan are against, but I think this personal connections and knowledge of the context are very important, and that can be lost if the process is centralized. In terms of marginalized population, I think, to be honest, they will need much greater incentives and resources to participate. Right now, it's just hard to blame people for not participating. Like, it's a very elusive benefit of maybe some small capital project being implemented in 5 years. It just doesn't sound very attractive. And the costs are very high. Like, I was hired there to observe, and people were working hard on planning and obtaining meeting with city people. Like it's a hard job. So I just don't know. So maybe it's better, instead of focusing on trying to bring more lay individuals, just focusing on some organizations that are aware of the needs of marginalized populations and try to bring those organizations that maybe really want to participate but haven't had enough resources. So maybe those marginal kind of groups, maybe it's possible to help them to make it easier for them. But then the problem with that would be, we know that participation has some benefits for individuals, right? So you have to participate to get some of those benefits, like education and developing trust and things like that. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Yulia. Appreciate your insights here. And Francesco, I think we'd love to hear your point of view from a practitioner's perspective about how much what the speakers have talked about agrees with your experience, and what kind of learning we can benefit from based on your several years experience working with participatory budgeting.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to be in a room full of PB nerds just like me. There aren't a lot of folks, I find, unfortunately, to have this conversation with. So shout out to everybody on the call who was able to make time today and join us. And really thank you, Dan and Don, for really showing some tough love to PB. I think we're in a moment where we can really think critically about what it looks like for community control to look like as we make large decisions about equitable recoveries, as we make decisions about climate change. And I think it's this kind of analysis and discussion that we need more of in order to really fulfill the promise of what we say PB is and what we think PB could be. So let me start there in appreciation. Real power and real money. So from a semantic point of view, I think my interpretation is really different than what Dan and Don have put forth. My experience in PB doing it for the first time in the city of Boston in 2014 and winning more and more elected officials over across North America, real money has been actually in contrast to simulated processes that were really pervasive. I've talked to cities across the world where they say they do PB and they show me a website where someone can like mess with their city's budget and do trade-offs and like provide their own template for what they think the city budget should be and do these budget simulations. And so I've always used the term real money to say, no, this is not a simulation. This is not a consultation. We're actually going to make decisions about money here. And the real power is that voting mechanism. Right? We're not asking for feedback on a budget. We're not baking a proposal for folks to respond to. You're actually going to get a chance to vote in what happens. I do appreciate the higher standard you've now set for that phrase and think that it's worth exploring and investigating. But from when I've used the terms real money and real power to win more PB processes across the US, it was in contrast to tokenism and other forms of less meaningful civic engagement processes. I really appreciate some of the things I'm seeing around paying folks to do this work. I am also someone who is pretty against volunteerism in general, right? If there is work to be done and it's valuable and we need people to do it, then people should be compensated for their time. I'm talking about budget delegates. I'm talking about people who are staffing our voting pop-up sites. I'm talking about steering committee members and district committee members. So I do want to lift up some agreement there. I think I really like the elimination of the budget delegate stage. There are different forms of PB, and I think the intention was to have folks play a larger role in what the ballot is. As we grew in New York City from doing this in 4 districts to doing this in 35 districts, while we scaled up theoretically, the process has largely remained the same. And some of the issues around cooperation from city departments, right? We knew that in year 3 and 4 would be issues, but we remain to do the same things in cycle 7, 8, and 9. And so I really love the invitation for finding new ways to do this. I can talk a little bit more about my issues with idea collection itself, and how that pairs and feeds into proposal development. And again, what the intention and theoretical thing was, and then what actually happens in practice. I do recognize that we're a little low on time, and so I want to make some time for questions that I see already popping up in chat. But I appreciate that observation as well. And I think a lot of this is rooted in something that you name early on in your book, right? The inherent tension with city council being the legislators who were executing on this, right? Being what you describe as the rowers and the steerers of the ship. Right, we see that come up during proposal development as folks are trying to get things vetted and cost estimated. And I think we also see that from a capacity point of view. Oftentimes the folks charged in district offices with doing PB that's maybe 20% of their job description. And so what does it look like to really fully resource folks and set people up for success? I've heard two things, one from, I think, Dan and Don around centralization, and one about the benefits of keeping things disparate. And I would say, let's think carefully about that, because what happens in the PB process, if we're under the banner of PB NYC, should be consistent and should have a container that is consistent. How it happens could be different for each district, how folks go about outreach, how folks engage voters, the methods and mediums and places where we meet residents where they are. The how could be different, but I think there is a very smart conversation to be had about what roles and responsibilities should be centralized. Is it a staff member in a city council office's best use of time to be emailing all the different Parks Department people to get estimates? Or can that work be centralized? Is that value of the district staff member, as I think Yulia suggested, maybe their best value add here is knowing which organizations can help reach out to marginalized folks, knowing people in their communities who should come and be a part of the design of this process. And so I think there's a very smart way to figure out what should be more centralized and what should be left up to different district offices. I talked a little bit about scaling up and consistency, right? We were working on Google Forms and spreadsheets and email lists to do this when there were 4 city council offices. And I think that is still the tech stack that we use today. And so what are the opportunities for folks to really lean into new platforms for this process? There have been tons of false starts with technologies that have claimed to be able to run a PB process, but now Europe is seeing different platforms take root. Some of those are making their way to the US. And so leaning into what the digital container is, I think makes a lot of sense as well. And I think one last thing I want to say is I don't feel bad that you weren't let into the delegate meetings. And I'll say that from someone who used to run delegate meetings. Because of, I think, a lot of the root issues that you identified, what ends up happening in practice is PB has promised so many different roles for volunteers, it actually becomes really hard to recruit folks for each specific roles. What I've seen happen is over the years, staff members who've been doing this find their group of super volunteers, and it might be 3 people, it might be 10 people, but it's the people that show up from designing the process to the idea collection assemblies, as budget delegates and as voting volunteers. Because the resources to really run the process are so limited, you end up with this core group of folks. And then things like meeting schedules actually depend on the availability of the smaller group of people. And then when suddenly someone shows up and says, I want to study this, flags go off. I don't know about what research consent looks like in this situation. And I'm going to say, you can't come in. Let's have a conversation before I just let you into this process. And so I understand both perspectives of it there. I'll stop there. I really am curious to hear what some of the other folks in the room have questions about and steer the conversation in that direction.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your comments and your experiences on this. This is really fascinating to hear where there's agreement, where there's disagreement. And I'm curious, the title of the book, Real Money, Real Power, maybe we should just call it The Real, right? The Real Participatory Budgeting might be a little bit more accurate and a little bit more all-encompassing. So I want to open this up for discussion. There are some great questions in the chat, but first I want to check in with Don and Dan to see if they have any reaction to what Yulia and Francesco just talked about. And is there any part of what their experience has been that you want to expand on a little bit based on your experience?
So I'd like to, I didn't take notes, so I don't recall exactly what everybody said, but let me say, I think the closed budget delegate process was definitely the worst part of the whole process. And I appreciate there might only be 3 people who are willing to do this, which the visibility of that itself reveals something about the organization. And if they're closed meetings, it's not visible. So, but I'm also an advocate for open government. I believe that as open as government can be is what it should be. I know this leads some people to not want to participate in government because they're afraid they will be revealed for what they do when they're participating in government, which they may think is perfectly legitimate, but might get them harassed, or it might be because they want to do something that's not appropriate, so they'd like to keep it to a small group. And it's hard to know which is going on if it's actually closed. So I was actually shocked to hear that they were closed. I thought about this. I looked into whether this was actually the city's position, but I know from a different situation that it seems to be the city's position, which is contrary to the advice given to a very similar organization, which is the community boards, which are required to comply with the open government laws, all the way down to their smallest meetings. And I'm actually surprised that the city believes that they don't have to do this. So I'll leave it at that. There's plenty else we could talk about, but that's probably enough for me for right now.
Yeah, I just want to say I resonate with a couple things that Yulia and Francesco mentioned. Yulia, that you did get into delegate meetings and had those differences, I think is worth exploring. And I appreciate, though, it seems like we're aligned on that equity point. They said, let's have equity. And then in practice, it became more of the, well, the delegates have voice, right, versus others. So I think that's something worth charging forward with. Francesco, I appreciated the simulation versus real distinction, because we should note that but 33 out of 51 districts participated in the year that we did this, which was 2018 to 2019. And so I think it's worth thinking about the framing of this. That's a real advance beyond what many cities and districts have nationwide. We have the most participatory budgeting processes in New York of any city in the US. So perhaps we're at a phase with this right now to be developed out further. And I think seeing it in the positive light, simulation versus real, is a great way of putting it. Just lastly say, I think there seems to be some alignment about distilling down PB to minimal expectations that are maintained across different council districts and things like that. And I think just from this conversation I'm coming out with, I would love to see that put together in even a one-pager by the city council, that every district must do these things at a minimum, but there's a lot of agency for each district to have freedoms around other parts of this process. I think laying out what those things are would be helpful for everyone.
Great. I want to note a question from the chat. Zachary Wood was asking about the messiness of implementation and the clientelism, the paternalism, and I would call it like elite capture or opportunity hoarding that might happen in this process. Do you think that that happens more often just because there isn't a budget for creating a process that isn't based on, you know, volunteerism, isn't based on if you put in the time, then you have more access processes? So how can that be revised and changed to be more universal without it being so professional that it's unaccessible? I hope, Zachary, I captured your question there. But.
I'm happy to jump in really quickly on a few things. I think when we talk about participatory budgeting, because New York has done it the same way in city council for about 10 years, we were married to this idea that it's a broad situation, that it has 4 steps that are idea collection, proposal development, voting, and implementation. Sorry, 5 steps. Design the process at the beginning. Now that we know what we're dealing with, now that we know that we have access to capital, what does it look like to maybe use some of these constraints to inform a better design of the process, right? If we're doing capital, maybe we focus 1 year on parks, maybe we focus 1 year on schools. Maybe we're upfront at first about what's possible with these, so that we're not starting every year saying, what would you do with $1 million in your district? Because oftentimes you're going to get answers with what people would do with $1 million. And it's rarely a capital project that's fundable by some of these city departments. And so what is idea collection doing actually? What is the proposal development phase doing actually? And is there a way that we can really have a better use of the public's time when they're setting priorities, so that we're not actually meeting people's expectations because our framing question is wrong? and our framing question is broad, and our framing question isn't useful to actually put together a budget of capital items.
I'm not sure, is Terry Amsler still here? Terry put something in the chat about back in the day, the PB process was sort of homegrown, diverse, with multi-sector steering committees that would set the ground rules, which could or should set the ground rules that might address at least some of these issues. Is that a potential process change reverting to that might, I mean, as it gets bigger, are we just encountering that it would be less and less homegrown and therefore not reflect the needs of the different communities that it's meant to serve?
I was looking at that. I don't know if that's actually a question or not, but I'd point out that this is a 10-year-old process now. It's no longer a homegrown new thing, novel to do. And it wasn't quite 10 years old when we looked at it, but it was close enough that we can say we're looking at how the mature process is working at the moment. And so I don't know. I know that one thing we should think about is that the city has authorized through a change in the charter a completely different process, which is the citywide participatory budgeting process. So it's worth keeping in mind that that is not some forcing the rest of this into the other council districts. It's a citywide process. There's a question up there that wasn't asked about access. I'm on the advisory committee for the citywide process. At least one of the staff are here. Maybe I won't be on the advisory committee after today, who knows? But I hope so. But in the citywide process, these issues need to be thought about, not so much to fix what's happening here, although I think some of it should be fixed, but to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that we ran into here. The closed delegate process should be avoided. There are different ways to go about that, but it should be avoided. And I don't know, the use of volunteers should be avoided as much as possible. There should be paid employees to do this work, paid employees to staff the voting locations, paid employees to have whatever meetings that are held. And they should be paid well. Most of them are going to be professionals, and it's going to be their full-time job. So it should be decent work for paid employees. And if they start out this way, it'll be a much better process for the city over the longer run.
Any of the other speakers want to jump on it? Or?
Yeah. For the two questions. So I think some people may got some impression that there is something sinister going on with budget delegates, which I would say that wasn't my impression. I don't think that people are there to advocate for something that's extremely beneficial personally for them. I think it's more about like some human limitations, right? Because as Francesco has said, you have 3-4 people willing to dedicate their time to this. And then they face hundreds of initial ideas. And then I think what just ends up happening is they have some preliminary idea of what's good for the community and what's feasible. And they just go ahead with that, as opposed to trying to process 100 projects, evaluate them based on lots of criteria, which I would say it just, unless you have a paid person, paid professional to do that, I wouldn't expect I wouldn't expect that of any lay person. So I think that's like the reason is just about like human limitations and human capacities, as opposed to, I mean, I've seen a few cases in which I suspected some kind of like something going on about some personal benefit, but it was very rare. As usually it's just people going with their initial idea, their previous experience of what's good for the community, something like that. And in terms of district committee, so I did observe a district committee in one district. And so basically district committee. So basically what happened, so district committee and budget delegates and volunteers were all the same people, right? But I think there were like good things about the district committee. So district committee helped a lot with the outreach. So outreach was much more comprehensive. So when I interviewed them, so they said that they also did some changes to the process. For example, a few years ago, when the city voting age was something like much older, so they changed that, and a lot because they work with teen organizations, so they wanted to incentivize them somehow to participate in the process. So as a district committee, they had some discretion to change the voting age, and that also helped them. So I think there were benefits to the district committee, but district committee, it's even more involvement than budget delegates, right? Like you have to be that super volunteer to be able to spend that much time and effort on the district committee. But I did see some real benefits from it.
Thank you, Yulia. We have a question that's kind of building on a couple of questions that you've already received. This is from Weijie Liu from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. They have two questions. One is they'd like to know whether there are some preliminary outcomes like improved citizens' trust in governments, increased transparency, and so on with participatory budgeting. And I'll just say that one of my undergraduates is writing his capstone on this very question about increased voting in areas where there's participatory budgeting. So I'm really excited to see that process unfold. But I'm also curious about just the squeaky wheel process, right? Of putting something on a ballot to kind of demonstrate, for instance, in my kids' school, we had something on a PB ballot about getting the lead out of the school, which maybe shouldn't be an optional thing, maybe should be required, right? And so part of that was also just raising consciousness that this is something that's happening in our public schools in New York City. So I'm wondering what are the spillover effects, as Weijie Liu is also asking. And then they also ask, some delegates try to propose their own projects, but they're interested also in what interest groups, external interest groups might do to enter into the process. Do they also have any success, even if they're not volunteers, in getting their issues on the ballot?
I don't think I can answer her questions directly, but I think we can offer some insight into this. Interest groups in the form of community advocacy groups are already deeply involved in the process. In fact, they seem to be the most effective, except for the schools, in getting what they want out of the process. And the schools are an interest group that is dominated by experts, right? So they're very good at getting what they want out of the process. One of the remarks that you made calls to mind that there's a problem with the entire council discretionary expenditure process, where it appears, this is my opinion, it's not out of the research. I have been on a community board. I have dealt with council members for about 20 years in one way or another, but it appears at the point of the discretionary spending and the things like bathrooms in the school districts is a sort of a symbiotic attempt for the schools to curry favor, or for example, the schools to curry favor with the council members so that the council members can make it look like they're doing something for the schools, so that that'll encourage their voters. That's what it appears to me. Bathrooms in schools should be a routine expense. The city has, I believe, a total of $40 billion between the expense and capital budget for the school districts. And there is no reason why the schools can't have their bathrooms repaired as a routine part of the process. And there are many other things that are going on in participatory budgeting or in the council member discretionary spending that look a whole lot like this, like things that should be done routinely in the first place. And there's some sort of symbiotic relationship between the agencies and the council members that creates the opportunity for the council member to step in to get something done when it should have happened in the first place. That's just where I am on that.
I can give an example of a PB process that we did recently that I think was an interesting way to sort of lean into actors in the community. Instead of doing idea collection, so this is a 100,000 process demonstration that we did with young people in New York City that we launched during COVID. And so it was an experiment in a few different ways. But we didn't do idea collection or proposal development. Instead, what we did was do a needs assessment, have conversations with young people to do some problem framing about what the needs are. And then, like Dan, I think, and Don suggest, just have an open proposal submission process. And so we invited organizations across the city that could do business with the city to just directly submit their proposals on a platform that was online and transparent. And you can see all the ideas that were submitted and vetted and what was approved and what was not approved, and everything that got approved ended up on the ballot. We were able to solve for the whole vetting issue by pegging the price point at $20,000. And so everyone was already designing for an agreed upon budget. This was not capital, which made things a lot easier. And I think what we saw was something really interesting where of course, folks who were self-interested and wanted to fund their organization submitted proposals. They did it in service of guidelines laid out by young people. And then young people were the voters and decision makers to what got funded. And so, you know, it all depends on how you design this and how you want folks to play a role in the process. Because folks are just funding some of their own organization, it doesn't automatically bad as long as we have the decision makers separate from that team.
Can I just ask a follow-up really quickly? Because Francesco, you mentioned it earlier that tech is a major way forward with this. I have been wondering, after writing this book, having these kinds of conversations, if all PB processes should be completely digital. And I know that bypasses that great in-person deliberation and face-to-face communication. We know, I think in the literature, to get to one of the previous questions, can promote trust and things like that. But perhaps, what would you say to that?
I would say resoundingly no. PB processes should not be only digital. Should they all have a digital component and container? I think it's invaluable for there to be a space that's online that not only can help administer the PB process, but as you're doing year 5, year 6, you can look back and have this institutional memory of what went on in previous processes. Digital just doesn't work for everyone. Everyone's relationship with technology is really different. The digital divide is real. We're working on it. But it's very important to me to have everything that you can do digitally in PB have a physical analog and vice versa, right? And we should be able to model this appropriately in a digital space.
And we're definitely learning that with the rollout of the COVID vaccine, that digital doesn't work for everybody, right? There are whole teams of people trying to help everyone get online with that. I really appreciate this conversation, and I feel like we could go on all afternoon. I certainly have more questions and things I want to learn, but we have about 4 more minutes left in the session, and I really want to thank our speakers and thank our participants. I put in the chat a link for an evaluation, which is also not just an evaluation, but a request for suggestions for other events that we might hold at the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management. So I hope you'll take literally 3 seconds to write that out, to click on that and do the evaluation. I want to thank our speakers, Don Waisanen, Dan Williams, for doing this work and for really making it accessible to so many people, and Yulia and Francesco for your commentary and your work to make these processes more democratic, more equitable, and accessible. And I just want to turn the floor back over to you and see, Don and Dan, do you have any final thoughts, or do any of the speakers have any final thoughts on what was presented today for our audience?
I'd like to thank the audience for coming to this. We didn't write the book just to have the fun of writing a book, which most people who've ever written a book know it's not much fun. We want to get the message out that it can be done wrong. Just and that you have to be careful, and that and back to the term real money, real power. And I appreciate Francesco's point of view on that, but you have to mean it if you're going to say it. Is where I am, and maybe from a point of view of a simulation, this is real in some sense, but from the point of view of actually making a difference in people's lives, it's not very real. And so thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, Dan. Don?
I don't have much to say. Just this is a great thing. Let's keep spreading it. I think PB needs to be embedded and scaled in every community. I really do. Let's just make it better.
Great. Yulia, any last thoughts?
Something that I haven't covered, so I haven't focused much on real power, real money, real power aspect. But my view on that is that that example was bathrooms, right? So, okay, we have the voting results, right? And let's say that's some kind of representation of what the community wants. I think the next step is for city agencies and city council members to take a close look at that and use that in their decisions, right? Because it's not necessarily about $1 million allocated. It's that is some kind of representation of what people want. And so I don't know, I think that those results must be like mandatory for studying by city agencies and city councils. And they have to provide some kind of response. Okay, we've read this and that's what we've done about that. And I know this has been done in Korea, which like, so they have this second kind of stage, you know, like, okay, now based on that, so what do we do next? I think that's important for real money, real power. Like, those projects are not end results. I don't think they are. Like, that's step towards something more important.
It's a part of the broader fabric of decision making. So great, thanks, Yulia. Francesco, do you have any last thoughts? And I just wanted to flag also, I really appreciate Francesco putting lots of resources in the chat, along with Wendy Trull, who posted resources in the chat, and also said that Dan is still welcome at the meetings and the advisory group. So that's good to know. But Francesco, do you have any last words?
I just want to show some gratitude again to Don and Dan for lifting this important work up, for taking this critical eye and having this conversation. Thank you, Christina, to you and your team for hosting this. I'm really excited about, you know, what we've done so far, and how the future could look radically different than what we know and love as PB, because participatory budgeting, I usually get in trouble for saying this, but PB is just voting on budget items. Everything else are our values that we assign to it. Is us living up to our value of equity-centered participation. It's us living up to our value of creating a more, you know, a society that's built for folks other than the people who have had positions of power in the past. And so I'm really excited to be working with folks on this call. I hope this isn't the last time I'm seeing anybody. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all the participants. I'll say that I'll send the recording out to everyone who registered, and we'll also make it available on our website, and I'll tweet about it a bit, because this has been a really fascinating conversation. So thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. I would say happy weekend, but we're not quite there yet. So have a great rest of your Thursday. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.